Welcome to Masters of Regeneration Radio. Conversations with humans who dare to reimagine our place on planet Earth. Earth is changing fast. Evolution happening in real time. An intimate, circular understanding of nature and living systems. We are the land. The land is us.
Hey everyone, it's Tomas Reyes, and this is episode 21 of Masters of Regeneration Radio. We transform the world, but we don't remember it. We adjust our baseline to the new level, and we don't recall what was there before. Daniel Pauly. Our guest today is Daniel Pauly, author of Vanishing Fish, an important book coming out next May 28th, 2019. Almost a quarter century ago, Daniel Pauly, one of the most important scientists of the Anthropocene, introduced the shifting baseline syndrome to explain our generational blindness to environmental destruction. It has since become one of the key terms framing climate change and other forms of planetary degradation. In his upcoming book, Vanishing Fish, Shifting Baselines and the Future of Global Fisheries, Daniel Pauly offers a devastating look at the state of today's global fisheries and a radical way to turn it around. He chronicles not only the arc of the fishing industry's demise, offering insights into how and why it has failed, but draws on decades of research to provide an up-to-date assessment of ocean health and an analysis of the issues that have contributed to the current crisis, including globalization, massive underreporting of catch, and the phenomenon of shifting baselines, in which over time, important knowledge is lost about the state of the entire natural world. And that speaks to so many other things. The loss of knowledge. The concepts, methods, and software which Daniel Pauly co-developed, documented in over 1,000 scientific and general interest publications, are used throughout the world, not least as a result of his teaching a multitude of courses and supervising students around the world in 5 continents in 4 languages. This applies also and especially to the EcoPath modeling approach and software, and FishBase, the online encyclopedia of fishes, and the latter recently complemented by Sea Life Base. And we'll put all those 3 links in the show notes on mastersofregeneration.com/podcast. Remember to go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts on your phone and give us 5 stars. Your feedback and reviews are truly appreciated. Before we jump right into episode 21 with Daniel Pauly, I'd like to share with you a question I've been asking myself a lot lately. What if the number one objective of us as a species was to protect the health of all life on Earth? That there was nothing else we could do but to follow this golden rule. As a species, our number one goal is always to protect the health of all life on Earth. How would that change all our production systems? By better managing natural resources, energy, the nutrient cycles on which all life depends, but also just shaping every other process under the sun to that golden rule. I think that there lies the answer to all of our predicaments. Anyway. In the last 3 weeks, Our Planet, the latest BBC series presented by David Attenborough, launched on Netflix. The Extinction Rebellion guys and Greta Thunberg are taking to the streets in Europe and around the world, which is important to say the least. And Brené Brown's The Call to Courage launched on Netflix as well. There is no courage without vulnerability, and there is no vulnerability without courage. Mainstream media seems to be catching up, and we're starting to see the glimpses of a new narrative at the heart of the human mind and the story we tell ourselves about reality. How does this work? How does this feel? What is really important? What is an illusion? We can also safely say that most people know we're screwed if we don't do something radically different right now as a species. We have 12 years, and there are so many variables at play. However, because it's the BBC, basically our planet, in the show Our Planet, David Attenborough says that we need, one, an energy revolution to replace fossil fuels, and so we can have clean air for all of us. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are more deaths than ever before due to unhealthy air quality around the world. Two, a food revolution. And again, in the show, the solution to food revolution is more efficient food production and less meat. We'll talk about that. Number three, ocean management. And number four, rewilding the world, because there is very little wild left. Again, obviously it's the BBC, and most likely our dearest honorary grandpa David Attenborough cannot say all he would like to say, I'm sure. And I would like to challenge big media to be a little more daring and direct. We have no time left for indirect, non-straightforward communication. We have no time left to say things like, just say things like more efficient food production. What does that mean? If I stopped someone in Shinjuku or Sao Paulo or Lincoln Road or Park Slope, whatever, and said, hey, what do you think are more efficient food production systems today, and why we need them? Why would anyone answer? Nobody has a clue. No one knows, I'm sure. I mean, perhaps I'll run into one or two permaculture geeks who have an answer to that. Anyway. In the last 3 weeks also, Notre Dame in Paris was on fire, as you might have seen. And because of how we evolved as a species, we have cared more about symbols than objective reality, because we are the symbolic species on the planet, right? Notre Dame burnt and millions were poured in as an emergency act of help from around the world. Belief systems have come and gone in human history. Temples have appeared and disappeared. We can totally do without them. They've evolved, they've changed. They're gone. Many of them are gone. History has shown that none of those systems are everlasting. But now, try and do that without clean food, clean water, clean air. Can you survive without them? No, right? So where's the emergency response to save ourselves? Not our mental constructs, but the actual stream of biology flowing through our bodies, which we call life, and cannot exist without air, water, food, sleep. No matter if scientists are now saying that objective reality may not exist, you know, those quantum everyday observations. The fact is that if you cut deep enough into this version of you or any organism alive today, it dies as it exists now in this dimension, assuming there are multiverses, you know. It's fairly basic. If you're not trained, it could take a minute or two for you to die from not breathing. If you're trained and are either an elite free diver or you're David Blaine, even 20 minutes won't cut it. You still need fresh air to survive. And past that insane amount of time, which is 20 minutes without breathing, it's checkout time. You're gone. Bye. Thank you. Thank you, by the way, plankton in the oceans and plants on land all around the planet for giving us oxygen for free. Please don't take it for granted. It's time to dramatically change our life. The reality of our dependence on the natural world is undeniable, and nature needs your help and focus. It's about surviving as a species. Please inform yourself and live different. If you don't know how to, feel free to ask around. Send me an email if you need some sort of guidance, or just Google it. But you can also send me an email at tomas@mastersofregeneration.com. We are all consumers. We're all citizens. We're submerged in air, in politics, and megacities, these monstrous machines of consumption. And by consumption, I mean not only stuff, but consumption of energy and nutrient cycles. We consume resources and energy and food and water. Did you know, by the way, that since 2008, the urban population worldwide surpassed rural population for the first time in history? That means there are over 3.5 billion people in cities worldwide. As of 2018, a UN report says 55.3% of the global population lives in cities. That's almost 3.9 billion people, 3.9 very hungry people who are eating, drinking, and consuming day in and day out. If we took just the first 45 megacities in the world, and by megacity, I mean a city with over 10 million people, they amount to over 800 million people. Tokyo is the largest with 38 million. That's like almost the population of Colombia. Big ones out there are Shanghai, Jakarta, Delhi, Seoul. Bogota is the last in the list with a little over 10 million. In the middle, there's the usual suspects: New York, São Paulo, Shenzhen, Cairo, Chengdu, Tehran, London, etc. You get the idea. There's a lot of us. That's one issue. We consume way too much. That's another issue. The overarching issue is how we consume and why. What's the story we've been told about what makes a good life? That's another important question I ask myself. In the last 50 years, it's been a story tied to economic growth and war. We must compete. The world is out there to get you. And the number one objective is economic growth. So wrong. Let me explain why. Let's say I'm a food manufacturer. I get ingredients and I make products. If my overarching goal is profit, then I do whatever is necessary to maximize profits. So I start shaping all the steps in my manufacturing process to reach that desired objective. If I make sausages, then I buy the cheapest possible meat, not caring how it was produced, and I apply for subsidies, or I simply buy the cheapest possible fillers, cornstarch, wheat starch, and because the meat I buy is such low quality, or a grind of bones and feathers and beaks, then I add chicken or pork flavor made in the lab, and then I add preservatives because, well, a man's got to feed their family, and we need to save money and make a lot of it so we can buy more stuff to sell cheaper to a large amount of people. We're obsessed with scale and growth. Same for fish farms, except fish farms actually assault the ecosystems around them even faster because it's all there in the water. None of these systems actually go in sync with seasons, with natural cycles, but they could. Before jumping into the details of other systems that are regenerative and in sync with how the natural world works, we could just look at changing one thing to drive the rest. And that's to change our goal, the number one goal. And that brings us back to the question I asked at the beginning. What if the number one objective of humanity as a species was to protect the health of all life on Earth? That there was nothing we could do but follow this golden rule. Just like the sun shines its energy every day on Earth to power the planet, the sun has no other choice, right? How would this change all our production systems? Sending you all love, gratitude, a lot of patience and perseverance. Thank you for listening. And here we go, episode 21 of Masters of Regeneration Radio. Our guest today is Daniel Pauly. Daniel, welcome to Masters of Regeneration Radio.
You are very welcome.
So tell me a little bit how you got interested in ocean management and fish stock. You have a very comprehensive database of how the fish stocks
it goes back a long time.
Okay.
I grew up in Europe. I was born in France and in Paris. I grew up in Switzerland and I studied in Germany.
Okay.
And I wanted to emigrate out into the developing world because it's where the action was and where I thought I could be most useful. This was the 60s when I studied. We wanted to change the world.
Yeah.
And I thought that food production would be a topic. You could choose agriculture, which was my first attempt. After one semester, I shifted to marine science and fishery biology. Now, you could say agronomy is to botany what fishery science, which is very applied, is to marine sciences. Marine science is a context in which fishery science is working, trying to extract a sustainable catch out of the ocean. And I worked in developing countries, and the issue seemed always to be lack of data in the developing world. So I developed methods to make data available. I developed to interpret the data that were there. I developed database to secure the data that were there and make them available to lots of people. And I was rather successful with this. But really the problem was not that we didn't have enough data. The problem was that there is between the science and the policy making a big gap, it's a chasm, it's a huge hole. And when I came to Canada, I started teaching at UBC in '94. I had lived in the Philippines and other countries in Asia before. When I came to Canada, I realized that this gap was also there. Canada had at the time the most prestigious fisheries management system in the world, the best research on cod and other fish in the world, and yet it had lost its major stock of cod, the northern cod of Labrador and Newfoundland, and that gives you to think, because the science was very good supposedly, and yet it collapsed. And it was clear that there is another element at work, and that element is the fishing industry having access to the politicians, to the ministers, to the people who make the decision, and the scientists not having that access, not having not being able to translate their knowledge into actual measures that you take on the ground. And if you study international fisheries, the same thing occurs again and again. In Europe, the common fisheries policy of the European Union is similarly, the scientists propose quota that would enable the stock to be maintained at a certain healthy level, and the politicians double them up and triple them because the constituent want it. And so the problem is really one of translating scientific knowledge into policy without the influence all the time of people who have only short-term interest at heart. Who only want short-term buck and buck in the short term. And the only social force that are identified that can withstand the onslaught of this politicking is the conservation community, is the environmental conservation community, from WWF on the gentle side to Greenpeace on the more radical side. This community has people who are qualified, who are devoted, and who are interested, and who pressure the system into taking more reasonable measures. But that system, this ecosystem of people of goodwill, usually lack data, lack analysis that they can use, because most researchers, most fishery scientists work for industry, indirectly or directly. Indirectly, when you work for government, you work for industry, because governments care only about industry. And also they cannot, if you work for the government, you cannot oppose government decision, even when they are glaringly wrong. So I have opted to become the data and information supplier of the conservation community.
Excellent. So you were first drawn to putting data into place so that you could have an objective look at what was happening with fish stock.
Yeah, and didn't help.
Yeah. Well, because there is all the fish industry lobbying to the government and all that. So in a way, you are providing the raw material for the conservationists to go and do activism, and and the conservationists are kind of like the muscle of your research in a way. Excellent. And it's very important, I think, right now. We can no longer pretend like nothing is going on, and we need to create new realities and push them a little harder than than we
Yes,
used to on a
this is
larger
the
scale.
same. This is exactly the same as the people who work on climate change. Climate change is a real threat, and it is now ongoing. And the scientists who work on climate change uh, have not been listened to at the time when we could have adjusted and minimized and mitigated and actually resolved this problem in the 70s and 80s. We could have dealt with this, nipping it in the bud. It would have been very cheap. It would have been less than 1% of GDP, certainly. Now it will be 3-4% of GDP, equivalent of a minor war. And if we don't do anything, it will be a huge fraction of GDP because our civilization is at risk. And that will be in a few decades. And so the point is, what do you need to be intervening? The evidence is there in front of you. And politicians who resort to ethnic separation of people and sloganeering and so on, they don't address the issue, but the issue doesn't go away. It just gets bigger and bigger.
Why do you think that is? Is it because of a focus on GDP as a goal for governments as a whole? Like the main goal is always economic growth and not protecting the environment or keeping the
Well,
ocean life
the
healthy?
the thing is, most of our politicians don't realize that that our economy is derived entirely from the environment. They will oppose uh, the economy and the environment, and as if we had a choice. But think about what foodstuff, for example, do we extract from the world that is not going through biology, that is not going through plants or animal? Salt and water. And water is also a resource that we squander. So basically, everything that we eat, everything that we use, fibers and stuff that we use for making things and selling things and stuff, it comes through nature. And if nature is not enabled to produce, and that is what we lose when we lose soils and when we lose the ocean as a productive system, then we lose we are not able to produce further. So the idea that we can grow the economy while destroying nature, it's actually wrong. And basically you have more and more of a Ponzi scheme growing the economy, and it can implode anytime now. It can implode because we're almost in free fall right now.
Almost what? Sorry?
In free fall,
Free
when
fall. Yes, absolutely.
when you jump off a cliff and you don't know that you are falling down because it's like somebody falling from the 50th stock of level of a high rise and arrived at the 20th level and say, oh my gosh, it's so far so good. Yeah, well, yes.
Yeah. So that's where your concept of, I think what you said touches upon one of the most important issues, which is the realization that we are completely dependent, that we live in a world on a planet that is an interdependent system of
Yes.
life,
This
right?
is why this
And
is crazy. The people talk about the value of the planet, and there is analysis that says it is 17 trillions or whatever. This is stupid because all of this is based on the idea that it is a fungibility, that you can exchange something for money and money for something, and it works. And if you go to the to a shop and you exchange money against tomato, or you sell tomato, or you buy tomato, you sell them, that works. Fungibility works, but you cannot do that with the ocean or with a planet.
yeah,
It has no price because because we cannot choose among planets. It, but
Yeah.
the fact that people do that, they give monetary value to ecosystem, is shows how silly that is, because you cannot buy an alternative, so it is priceless, and it also when people give ecosystem service, you have probably heard this term.
Yes.
It also the ecosystem service of providing oxygen to the world, for example, the ocean provide about half the oxygen in the world. Well, how long can you live without oxygen? About 2 minutes, and then you start choking to death, right?
Yeah.
So is it something that is fungible? You can exchange oxygen against tomato or against stalks of apple ink. You cannot. You cannot, because it's a condition for the whole thing to operate. And the people who think the economy and ecology is different spheres, as opposed to one being embedded in the other, they are so wrong. It makes Angel weep. But it has to do with most politicians being lawyers and not knowing anything about ecology. They believe that the law of nature, including gravity, is something that you can argue about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why professors like you and researchers around the world are doing what they are doing, kind of getting a little more active than usual in the participation of at the end of the day, I think it's we need to educate the public in a larger scale. I love this talk by Hans Rosling, who was an expert in global health. I'm sure you
Yeah.
knew his work, and where he showed the dimensions of human development categorized as means or as goals, and he gave them a value. And he said, well, what happened is that we mistook one thing for the other, and we gave economic growth a lot of value as a goal, when economic growth only has value as a means.
Yeah.
But the goals should always be, and here I disagree with what he used to say, because he said, first of all, it's human rights, and then it's culture, and then it's the environment. But I say, well, if the goal for everybody on the planet right now is not to protect the environment and all of life and the natural cycles, we're screwed, because that's what sustains everything else.
Well, you could also call it a mean to achieve human rights. You cannot have human rights when people starve to death, for example.
Yeah.
And this is now a real possibility. If you disrupt the climate too much, you will have, for example, failure of the monsoon. And one monsoon failing in South Asia means that India is in deep trouble, Pakistan, and that could unlash wars and stuff. So you cannot maintain human rights when people starve to death. Again, we have the World Food Program in Rome, in FAO, has about 3 months of food to supply a major country. 3 months. And that's how much humanity has in the bank, so to say. And with the politician that we have now, especially in the US, the question is, if we have a catastrophe of that kind, will we have deliveries of food, massive, the kind of thing that only an army can provide, to regions that are affected? No. I remember when the crisis in '98 hit Southeast Asia, Thailand announced that they were not going to export as much rice as they had, because Thailand is a major rice exporter.
Mm-hmm.
At the same day, riots began in the Philippines about rice prices, because immediately following the announcement, rice prices were upped before anything physical had happened, before any plane or any ship coming from Thailand had turn back or anything. Before anything had happened physically, the price of rice had increased, and the rice seller in the Philippines, who are often ethnic Chinese, were attacked for doing that. And basically, what it means is that every time we have an environmental problem, it is reduced to ethnic animosities. In Syria, when there was a drought before a bit before the Arab Spring, and this drought forced about 3 million Syrians to leave the countryside where they were farmed, get to the cities. That brought enormous instability to the system and is one of the causes for the protests against the government, which then became a civil war, and which then became a religious nonsense and a regional war with Turkey and the US and Iran, anybody involved. We absolutely completely forgot the fact that it was triggered off by an environmental crisis, and we can expect given the way our minds work, we can expect this to happen again and again.
Wow. Yeah, as soon as if now we can shift we can go to your concept of shifting baseline, the shifting baseline syndrome, to go into detail about what happens to our amnesia. How do we remember, or how do we make sense of the objective state of the natural world we're in?
The thing is that's right. Shifting baseline, which are the essay that I wrote in '95, is reprinted in that book, Vanishing Fish, and commented upon. And basically, the essay stated that every generation used the state of the world at the beginning of their conscious life, say professional life, as measure for the rate of change. And then at the end of their career, when they are 60 or so, they assess the change that happened during their lifetime. But change had already begun when their parents were young and when their grandparents were young and so on. But they usually don't account for the change that have happened to previous generation. So basically the baseline that you use to assess the world shift every generation. So, for example, the cold winter that I experienced as a kid, they will not serve as baseline to my children, to my own children, because they have not maybe experienced them, and so on. So basically, it is a mechanism, obviously, that protects us because it makes us adapt. It allows us to adapt to all kinds of situations. That's why we are an invasive species. We left Africa 70,000 years ago, and we adapted to everything. Life in the desert, life in a Tibetan mountain, life in Siberia, life in South America, in the Amazon. We could adapt to everything because we forgot our past. We forgot we are not rooted to certain environmental condition, like an over-specialized insect or other animals. We are like a rat or like cockroaches. We adapt to lots of environments, and this is a positive thing. This has made us very successful as a species, but it prevents us from actually intervening when the change is bigger than we can master. Mm-hmm. So before, when people had devastated a valley, say deforested it, they could always go to the next valley, or hunted everything that was that moved. They could always move to the next valley. We don't have a next valley that we can move to. We don't have a next island to move to. We don't have a next planet to move to. Even though Elon Musk would like to, yeah.
It's going to take a while, yeah.
It's going to take a while.
hence the importance, I believe, of what makes us special from what you described as a species is our capacity to transform the environment in large numbers.
And to transform ourselves to live in this transformed environment. Uh, this this is a positive thing that has made us uh, the master of the earth, but we don't master the way the earth responds, and it responds by having fever, uh, by having fever, and this fever is is very, very threatening because because the animals and the plants that we need cannot handle the temperature increase. Most fish they escape. They try to escape toward the poles. They move toward the poles as at about 50 kilometers a decade. So about 5 kilometers a year. They move. And this process began in the 70s, and you can see it all over the place. Um, they So if you are in New York, you will have in the harbor you will find fish that occur in Florida before. If you're in Quebec, you will find in the St. Lawrence estuary fish that occur in North Carolina or something.
Is it because the colder waters have better conditions for reproduction or
Well,
food or anything?
because each fish is adapted to a certain temperature, and if the temperature locally increase, they have to move to somewhere
Okay.
else, where the temperature is the one that the temperature is the one that they need. So they are not looking for cooler temperature; they're looking for the same temperature. And what we have is
Keeps on rising.
that the same temperature is now occurring further toward the pole. In the southern hemisphere, the same thing happens. Now, fish that were occurring in Brisbane are in Sydney, and things that were occurring off Sydney are now occurring in Tasmania. This is documented thousands and thousands of times, and we have done models that show the pattern that can simulate this effect, and we can show that the fisheries in the tropics will go down the tube in the 50s in the 50s of this century because because the fish that leave the tropics are not replaced by other fish from the hypertropic, right? So the tropics, where in Quebec, for example, or in New York, there will be a replacement of fish from further south. In the tropics, the fish that leave are not replaced by anything. So, so that is, and the same thing happens on land. The temperature is too high for rice, for example. Rice production diminished by about 10% per degree centigrade. Now, rice is basic food and in much of Asia, and when its productivity goes down, people are in trouble. Will be in trouble. Now, the cornucopian, the people who believe that we can produce what forever, they tell you that we can improve rice. We can actually improve rice. We can put more water, more fertilizer, more everything, but in the process we ruin the soils, and everything else goes down the tube. So yes, we can increase rice production if we want, but then lots of other things we lose. So
Yeah,
at the end, we have lost, and then there is the population. We could perhaps meet the needs in a sustainable fashion of 6 million people, but we have 7 billion people. And we could perhaps manage with 8, but we will have 9. And we could perhaps do it with 9, but we have 10. In other words, the basic driving factor is that we have this crazy growing population, and every time we meet the needs of that growing population, then it grows more.
Yeah, yeah.
And, and that is something that we cannot win because, again, we have a finite planet. And now I'm sure that there is a word for what I said, that you can dismiss it. It's called neo-Malthusian. Pauly is a neo-Malthusian.
What does that mean?
That means that, like the Malthus, you believe that the Reverend Malthus of living the time of Charles Darwin, you believe that something must be done to prevent population from growing. And it was at the time Malthus predicted that we would run out of food. That was before we discovered how fertilizer and the use of genetics could improve crops. So we have, I don't know, there were perhaps 1 billion people at the time he lived. So he was wrong at the time. We did manage. And again, we managed with 7. We will manage with 8. We will manage with 10. But we cannot do that forever. There is a point at the end. And so if philosophically we have to admit that there is a limit, and then practically we can then derive policies from it. And these policies have to be that, for example, every woman on earth should be able to decide how many kids she has. That follows directly from it. Because what the first thing that we don't want is people having children that they don't want to have. Right?
Clearly.
That's the first thing. Then whether governments can ever have the right to say how many children we should have, like in China, that is something that perhaps we don't have to think about. Because if women can decide how many children they have, it turns out they don't want that many. So let's do that. And the difficulty of increasing production of rice and of fish and of everything will be a little bit mitigated. But that we don't do either. We have population that grows that are poor. So we have to raise income, but the population is increasing faster. So I was just you take Mexico. I was in Mexico a few days ago, and the growth rate of the population is about 1 to 2%, and the growth of the economy is 1 to 2%. It means that simply you have this massive investment, massive production of everything, and you end up with the same income.
Yeah.
For more people.
Yeah.
It's a crazy thing. We should be able to guarantee everybody a basic income, a basic life that is sufficient for a good life, and we could do that. But we can't do that if we, at the same time, must accommodate more and more and more and more people.
Yeah.
But you barely can talk about it, because as soon as you talk about it in the US or in Canada or in Europe, people say, well, the brown people must have fewer children, but not us. Well, actually, us also. When I hear some people, especially well-to-do, they want to do five kids. How do you conceive? Who needs your litter? You know, who needs all these kids from you?
Well, it appears that fewer and fewer people are.
We have a serious conceptual problem. We can resolve our problem, but every time we cannot at the same time accommodate increasing greed. We cannot accommodate increasing population. We cannot accommodate. You can define a problem, and then you can define it. You can add difficulties. At some point, it is not solvable anymore.
Yeah. Is it also a problem of management? Say, how do you understand how the natural world actually works. How, like you were saying, how does the ocean replenish its fish stock? So it's a two
I don't,
side.
I don't think, I don't think that we lack knowledge. Obviously, we don't know everything, and we could acquire much knowledge. Uh, for example, if we dive at 5,000 meters depth, we find species that we don't know, and they do things that are wild and stuff. But it's not the fish that we find at 5 kilometer depth that are going to feed humanity.
Yeah.
The production of biomass of fish flesh, so to say, is that is important for us is down to 300, 400 meters, and where light penetrates and where the bodies of plants, plankton that have been that has grown in the lighted zone, fall down and can be consumed by fish. Deeper than that, you have a desert.
Yeah.
It's a desert similar to the Sahara in underwater. So this will not the knowledge that we acquire in this is fascinating for its own thing, but it has nothing to do with production of food any more than studying fossil in the Gobi Desert. In the Gobi Desert, you can go into the Gobi Desert, find lots of things about the Gobi Desert, but it has nothing to do with feeding China. See what I mean?
Of course.
And the when people discuss about the marine world, they present the mysteries of the sea. This is Cousteau's phrase, right?
Yeah.
As if we could resolve them, we would have access to lots of food. This is not so. The food production system, whether we're talking about aquaculture in the sea, the production of mollusk and so on, or fisheries, we understand the system enough to know what to do. We should not, for example, subsidize them. This is something that our politicians don't understand. You see, when you provide a subsidy to a car factory, or to a computer factory, it can produce a computer or car that may not find enough customers. For example, if you want to encourage the sale of electric cars, because you would like to encourage the transition toward sustainable energy.
Okay.
So at present, the electric cars, are not really competitive to people who don't care about the energy transition. If you really want to go from A to B, and every day, electric cars don't really do the job. And but you can have a subsidy from the government that makes the car cheaper. I have a Prius that was bought with a subsidy, right, from the Canadian government, because it want to. Okay, that's subsidy can do good things and encourage a transition. Now, in fisheries, the subsidies come in when the fish are getting more scarce, and the fishers don't make money anymore fishing them, don't make enough money, and so the subsidy is given so they continue exploit. The problem is that when you exploit too much, when you fish too much, you don't catch more, you catch less. And so a subsidy doesn't contribute at all to increasing the catch. It contributes only to enable the fisher to continue operating even if he has a small catch.
Could there be a subsidy to change the way you organize your fishing operation?
No.
Would that help at all?
Subsidy,
No.
subsidy that would help in cases of overfishing is a subsidy to get the hell out of fishing. So, no, seriously,
Okay.
you can have a decommissioning subsidy, a subsidy to buy out the boat and break it.
Okay.
It's called decommissioning subsidy, or a subsidy to enable you to retrain you in another job for a young fisher, or a subsidy to have a pension, because most fishers, they don't really invest in retirement as they should, and they are old people, they're old men, and they're broke. So a subsidy to retire in dignity,
Okay.
that could help fisheries, because they would be less fishing, and the stocks would recover and produce more. That's the paradox.
Yeah, of course.
You can actually catch more if the stocks have recovered, and they recover if you fish less.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
fishing less gives you more fish,
Yes.
and when you have an overfish situation. So subsidies can help, but only if they are directed toward fishing less. And it's not helping the fishery to become more efficient. It's helping the fishery to become smaller.
Yeah.
So
That's why you were saying that small scale fisheries could
yes,
supply
yes,
the majority of
because
the world's
if
fish.
industrial fishing were not subsidized, uh, it actually much of industrial fishing would have to be wound down. These boats, many of them, most of them, I would think, many of them actually don't fish for fish, but they fish for subsidies.
I see, I see.
It's
So it's
subsidies that,
about the same as the industrial agriculture or industrial ranching,
yes.
the
If they had to pay ranchers, if they have to pay the real price of getting the 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 cattle on marginal land, um, that doesn't belong to them. Uh, the degradation, the land degradation that they cause. If they had to pay for that, they would not be um, profitable, and meat would be more expensive, and we would have less methane uh, going into the atmosphere and stuff. So subsidies can be very damaging. They can also be good. I mentioned
of
uh,
course.
the transition subsidies to install photovoltaics on your roof uh, that are used in California massively to push the country into to push that state into sustainability. But mostly the subsidies are, are given to maintain crazy industry. For example, the fossil fuel industries are subsidized uh, to a tremendous extent that is completely at works against the transition, works against um, um, actually is causing is the one of the major cause of for global warming. Yeah.
So I see a pattern in a decentralizing trend of food production, where small scale agriculture or small scale fisheries and so on and so forth could help out, into the
Yeah, I there is yes, but it's not driven by small is beautiful. It's driven by the fact that the big companies have chosen um, mode of production and that are not sustainable. If the big companies were uh, renewing the soil, working for on their own, reestablishing the soils on which they work, if they were not pumping waters like in a way that is not sustainable, and if they were not themselves, if they're not using overusing pesticide and fertilizer. There is no point arguing against the big companies, but they are the ones who do it. And small farmers tend not to do that unless they are kind of forced by big companies that they work for
Yeah.
to do. Same thing with fishes. Small-scale fishes don't do the stuff because the stuff that big industrial fishing does. One, because they cannot, simply because of the gear they don't have, and also because they are embedded in communities that they are members of, then that will be asking, what the hell are you doing? Whereas the big companies, they cannot care less because there is nobody to whom they are responsible except the stockholders, and and so and so I I argue that small scale fisheries and and owner operated boats are better, but it's not. I'm not coming from small is beautiful.
Of course.
It's well, I could, but I I'm coming from the fact that big companies don't have the constraints uh, on them that are inherently eh, making sustainability possible.
So many variables and
So many variables.
so many challenges as well. Would there be anything that would you have any piece of advice for the consumers out there that are listening?
But basically, the a question that often comes is, what can I do as consumer?
Yeah.
And this question actually has two parts that people are not aware of. What can I do? And the second is as consumer. And there is lots of things that you can do, but not as consumer, uh, because the consumers is a very limited is a limited part of you.
Yeah.
The consumer is go to the shop and buy something, and you can only choose from from whatever is offered, uh, what is uh, what is, for example, sustainably caught or sustainably grown. And the fraction of the population that cares, that can afford to care financially
Yeah.
about such things, is about 5 to 10%. That can afford and care about where this food comes from. The
Yeah.
majority cannot afford and doesn't know about it and cannot be reached either. So the as consumer we can actually not do much. And I'm sorry to 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 how do you say it? To contradict something that everybody believes in, that consumers have power, but they don't, because they can. Consumers can act, can influence only a small fraction of the market. I think that that we can change things as citizens, and because if we manage to raise enough help about an issue by joining an environment group, writing letters uh, to our representative, visiting them and town hall, and telling them what, and so being politically active,
Yeah.
we if we can get the state or the government to act, the governments can reach the other 90% of the population that cannot be reached. In other words, for example, if I'm against um, consuming, say, for example, I'm against us cutting the fins of all the sharks in the world for shark fin soup. I can refuse to drink it. I can tell my Chinese friends to not eat it. I can support a cause that argues against it and stuff. But it's very limited.
Yeah.
If I if I because beyond the 5-10%, uh, nobody cares. You you can actually devote the same amount of energy, the same amount of PR, the same amount of time to reaching your local representative. Other people do the same, and all of a sudden you have a law that bans the consumption of shark fin soup in the country, and that is the thing, and where the government plays its role as force multiplier. That's how we got rid of smoking. We didn't get rid of smoking by ceasing to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah, or educating people, or
educating people about the danger of smoking. It is forbidden to smoke, period.
Yeah.
And to smoke in the airplane. And
good point.
So people must learn from successes, and the smoking thing was done that way. It was done by directing the anger and the activism and stuff toward a change in the law.
Yeah.
And thus it magnified, like a lever, the push of the people who had understood the problem. It magnified the effect and the impact onto the population as a whole.
That's a great insight. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And if you understand this, once you have understood this, you direct. Imagine a scene where people, they don't want to eat a certain fish in a restaurant. They tell their friend, "Don't eat this fish. It's not sustainably caught," and everything. And they can tell the waiter or the waitress, you should tell your boss. But that is a poor student who is earning a minimum wage to pay the tuition in a college. The stuff, the complaint that you have is going to be horizontal. It doesn't reach anybody. If you, on the other hand, go to Greenpeace and distribute leaflets in front of a shop that sells that stuff, well, the shop owners will be looking bad. They are ashamed, publicly ashamed, and so shame works much better than guilt.
Yeah.
That is another version of it.
Yeah.
Vertical activism much works better than horizontal activism.
Yeah.
Shame works better than guilt.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that's a great insight, and it actually reminds me of a dear friend who passed away a couple of years ago. We did an episode about his work. I don't know if you've seen the documentary. It's called Shark Water.
Yeah.
And they have managed to change a lot of bills around the world and fight, the illegal shark finning industry.
And it was not achieved by refusing to eat shark fin soup.
Exactly. So thanks again for such a great insight, Dr. Pauly. Thank you so much for your time. This was very informative, and I look forward to your book. And where can people go and find out more about your work?
I think www.seearoundus, in one word, seearoundus.org.
Beautiful.
Okay.
All right. This was Daniel Pauly, everyone. Daniel, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye.